Listen to me carefully, because what I'm about to tell you will disturb you. Right now, as you sit there, you believe you're making choices. You believe you're living your own life, pursuing your own dreams, thinking your own thoughts. But I must tell you something uncomfortable, something I learned after decades of watching both the powerful and the powerless. Most of what you call your life was designed by someone else. Your habits, your fears, your daily routines, even your definition of success, nearly all of it was carefully constructed to keep you exactly where you are. They trained you, not with chains or whips, but with something far more effective. They trained your mind to accept limitation as reality, to mistake comfort for safety, and to confuse obedience with virtue. And the most brilliant part of this system? You defend it. You protect your own cage. I'm Benjamin Franklin, and I've spent my entire life studying power. Not just political power or wealth, though I've known plenty of both. I've studied the invisible architecture of human systems, the hidden mechanisms that determine who rises and who remains trapped. I've sat with kings and conversed with common laborers. I've built businesses, helped birth a nation, and watched carefully how societies shape the minds of their citizens. And what I discovered troubles me still. The greatest theft isn't of your money or your time. It's the theft of your belief in your own capability. They stole your permission to imagine yourself as powerful. Now you might be wondering who they are. Let me be clear. This isn't some shadowy conspiracy conducted in secret rooms, though such things exist. The system I'm describing is far more mundane and far more pervasive. They are your schools that taught you to sit still, raise your hand, and wait for permission to speak or even use the bathroom. They are the employers who pay you just enough to return tomorrow, but never enough to gain independence. They are the media voices that fill your head with fear, comparison, and manufactured desire. They are the cultural stories that celebrate compliance and mock ambition. But here's what troubles me most. After years of this conditioning, they become you. You internalize these rules. You begin to police yourself, to shrink yourself, to silence your own dreams before anyone else can. Let me tell you why I know this system so intimately. I was born into poverty so complete that my formal schooling ended at age 10. I was 10 years old, and my education was declared finished. My father was a candle maker, and I was destined to follow him, to spend my life in that small, smoke-filled shop making candles and soap. The system had a place for me, you see. It had already decided my worth, my potential, my future. Every social structure around me confirmed this destiny. My economic class, my limited education, the expectations of my community, all of it whispered the same message. Benjamin, know your place. Accept your station. Be grateful for what little you have. But something in me rebelled. Not loudly at first. It wasn't some dramatic moment of defiance. It was quieter, more persistent. It was a refusal to accept that my circumstances at 10 years old should define my entire existence. I became apprenticed to my brother as a printer, and while my hands set type, my mind wandered into forbidden territory. I began to question everything. Why should birth determine destiny? Why should poverty equal stupidity? Why should the lack of formal education mean the lack of education entirely? These questions were dangerous because they threatened the stability of the entire social order. I started reading everything I could find, teaching myself through borrowed books studied by candlelight after exhausting workdays. I taught myself to write by copying the essays of great thinkers, then trying to recreate them from memory, then comparing my versions to the originals. I had no teacher, no university, no permission to educate myself. In fact, quite the opposite. The system actively discouraged this behavior. Self-improvement among the lower classes was seen as dangerous, as getting above your station, as developing ideas inappropriate to your rank. But I persisted, and gradually I discovered something extraordinary. The primary difference between the powerful and the powerless wasn't intelligence or talent or even opportunity. It was simply this: the powerful believed they were allowed to be powerful. This realization changed everything for me. I began to see the invisible bars of the cage. I noticed how language itself was designed to maintain hierarchy. The poor were taught to speak of luck and fate, while the wealthy spoke of strategy and planning. The poor were encouraged to be humble and accept God's will, while the rich were praised for ambition and self-determination. The poor were told that virtue lay in contentment, while the rich understood that virtue lay in expansion. Two completely different operating systems, installed in different classes of people, ensuring that each would perpetuate their own condition. Let me share something that will seem obvious once you hear it, yet remains invisible to most people their entire lives. From your earliest years, you were systematically trained in helplessness. Think back to your childhood schooling. What were you actually learning? Yes, there was reading and arithmetic, but underneath those subjects was a deeper curriculum. You were learning to sit still for hours despite your natural energy. You were learning to suppress your curiosity and follow the lesson plan. You were learning that your value came from external approval, from grades and gold stars and teacher praise. You were learning that there was always an authority who knew better than you, whose permission you needed, whose approval you sought. You were learning to live on a schedule determined by bells and buzzers, to eat when told, to rest when told, to speak only when called upon. Does this sound like training for independent thinking? Or does it sound like training for factory work and corporate employment? No. Before you dismiss this as cynicism, understand that I'm not condemning teachers or schools entirely. Many educators genuinely want to help children. But the structure itself, the very design of mass education, was never primarily about liberating young minds. It was about creating reliable workers, obedient citizens, and predictable consumers. The Prussian model of education that spread across the Western world was explicitly designed to produce soldiers and factory workers, people who could follow orders, tolerate boredom, and suppress individuality for the sake of the collective. And it worked magnificently. It still works today. Consider the absurdity of how you were taught to think about time. You learned that productive time meant sitting still, that valuable work happened during specific hours, and that rest was something you earned only after sufficient obedience. Your natural rhythms were ignored. Some people think brilliantly at midnight, others at dawn, but school demanded everyone perform at the same hours regardless of their individual nature. This wasn't an accident. This was training. Training to accept that your time isn't your own, that your energy belongs to the system, that your natural inclinations must be suppressed in favor of institutional convenience. Then there's the way they taught you to think about money. You were probably told that money doesn't grow on trees, that you should save for a rainy day, and that a penny saved is a penny earned. I said that last one myself, and it's true enough. But notice what it emphasizes: scarcity, conservation, the assumption that resources are limited, and your job is to cling tightly to whatever scraps you manage to accumulate. Now, consider how the wealthy are educated about money. They learn that money is a tool, that capital seeks returns, that resources can be multiplied through intelligent investment, that leverage and other people's efforts can build fortunes. Same substance, completely different relationship. One group is taught to fearfully hoard pennies. The other is taught to confidently deploy millions. And both groups believe their perspective is simply common sense. The training went deeper still. They taught you to fear uncertainty, to crave security above all else, to see steady employment as the ultimate goal. Do you remember learning about entrepreneurship in school? About calculated risk-taking? About the skills needed to identify opportunities and marshal resources? No, you learned to fill in the correct bubbles on standardized tests. You learned that there was always one right answer, determined by an authority, and your job was to guess what they wanted to hear. This is catastrophic training for anyone who wants to navigate the complexity of actual life, where the most important questions have multiple valid answers, where context determines strategy, and where independent judgment is essential. But perhaps the most insidious part of your training was what they taught you about your own capabilities. Every time you needed permission to speak, to move, to question, to deviate from the plan, you internalized a message: you are not capable of self-direction. Every time you were sorted, ranked, and graded against your peers, you internalized competition and comparison as the measure of worth. Every time a subject confused you and you were rushed forward to the next topic, you internalized that some knowledge just wasn't for you, that you had limits, that certain territories of understanding were beyond your reach. I watch people carry these early lessons into their adult lives like invisible chains. A brilliant woman hesitates to start her own business because she's still waiting for permission, still wanting someone in authority to tell her she's ready. A talented man stays in a soul-crushing job because the alternative feels uncertain, and he was trained to fear uncertainty more than misery. A creative spirit never shares their art because they internalized early criticism and still believe that external approval determines value. These aren't character flaws. These are the predictable results of systematic conditioning. Now, let me tell you what they never taught you, what in fact they actively concealed from you. You have within you, right now, the capacity to learn nearly anything, to build nearly anything, to become nearly anyone. That's not motivational exaggeration. That's observable reality. The human brain remains plastic throughout life. Skills can be developed at any age. Knowledge is now more freely available than at any point in history. The barriers that once legitimately prevented people from rising, the lack of books, the restriction of information, and the guild systems that hoarded knowledge, most of which have crumbled. Yet people remain trapped, not by external barriers but by internal ones, by the training they received, by the beliefs they carry about what's possible for someone like them. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. When I was a young man in Philadelphia, I noticed that the city had no public library. Books were extraordinarily expensive, available only to the wealthy. This was one of the primary mechanisms by which knowledge, and therefore power, remained concentrated among the elite. The poor couldn't educate themselves because they couldn't access books. Simple, effective, brutal. But I wondered, what if we pooled our resources? What if 50 ordinary working men each contributed a small amount, and together we built a shared collection of books? The idea seems obvious now, but at the time it was revolutionary. I was told it wouldn't work, that working men wouldn't value books enough to contribute, that they wouldn't be disciplined enough to return the volumes, that this kind of collective resource was impossible to manage. In other words, I was told that poor people couldn't be trusted with knowledge. But I proceeded anyway, and we created the Library Company of Philadelphia, the first lending library in America. It was an immediate success. Working men were hungry for knowledge. They were careful with the books. They educated themselves in science, philosophy, history, and practical skills. And the effect was extraordinary. Philadelphia began producing a disproportionate number of skilled craftsmen, innovative thinkers, and successful merchants. Access to knowledge created access to opportunity. But here's what fascinated me most. The biggest obstacle wasn't creating the library itself. It was convincing working men that they were allowed to educate themselves. Many had internalized the belief that serious learning was for their betters, that they should content themselves with practical skills and leave intellectual pursuits to the educated classes. I had to persuade them that their curiosity was legitimate, that their minds were capable, that knowledge wasn't a privilege of birth but a tool available to anyone willing to pursue it. The external barrier to book access was easy to solve. The internal barrier of permission and self-belief was far more challenging. This is what I mean when I say they trained you to be poor. Poverty isn't primarily about lacking money. It's about lacking belief in your own agency. I've known people with empty pockets who were psychologically wealthy, who understood that circumstances were temporary, who believed in their own capability, who saw opportunity where others saw only obstacles. And I've known people with substantial bank accounts who were spiritually impoverished, who lived in constant fear of loss, who never felt they had enough, who couldn't imagine themselves as truly powerful. The difference wasn't in their financial statements. It was in their operating system, in the beliefs they held about themselves and their relationship to the world. Let me be specific about the mechanisms of this training, because once you see them clearly, you can begin to dismantle them. First, they taught you to trade time for money linearly. You learned that income comes from hours worked, that more money requires more hours, and that there's a direct and proportional relationship between your time and your earnings. This is wage slave thinking, and it's extraordinarily limiting. The wealthy understand that income can be decoupled from hours through ownership, through systems, through leverage. They understand that you can earn while you sleep if you structure things correctly. But you were never taught this. You were taught to show up, work hard, and accept whatever hourly rate or salary someone offered you. Second, they taught you that employment equals security. You learned to seek the steady paycheck, the benefits package, the retirement plan. You learned that having a job meant you were responsible, that unemployment was shameful, that your identity was tied to your job title. They never taught you that employment is simply trading time for money at a predetermined rate, often the worst possible rate. They never taught you that true security comes not from a single employer, but from multiple streams of income, from skills that transfer across industries, from the ability to create value independently. You see, the institution that educated you had a vested interest in producing employees, not entrepreneurs. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. It created compliant workers who would fill the offices, factories, and cubicles of the economic machine. And it succeeded brilliantly. Third, they conditioned you to fear failure more than you valued learning. Every test, every grade, every evaluation trained you to avoid mistakes rather than embrace them as teachers. You learned that failure meant you weren't smart enough, weren't trying hard enough, weren't good enough. The red marks on your papers became symbols of inadequacy, rather than roadmaps for improvement. In my own time, I failed constantly. My first newspaper failed. Many of my scientific experiments produced nothing but smoke and confusion. I made diplomatic blunders that could have cost our young nation dearly. But I understood something that your schools forgot to teach. Failure is simply information. It tells you what doesn't work, so you can discover what does. Every successful person you admire has failed more times than you've even tried. The difference isn't that they're more talented, it's that they weren't paralyzed by the fear your education instilled in you. Consider Thomas Edison, who famously said he didn't fail 1,000 times inventing the light bulb, he simply found 1,000 ways that didn't work. Imagine if he'd been graded on each attempt. Imagine if each failure had gone on his permanent record, lowering his GPA, limiting his future opportunities. He never would have persisted. He would have stopped after the first few tries, accepted that he wasn't good enough, and returned to something safer. That's what your education did to you. It taught you to play it safe, to color inside the lines, to give the expected answer rather than explore the unknown. It rewarded conformity and punished deviation. And now, years later, you find yourself stuck, afraid to start that business, afraid to switch careers, afraid to invest in yourself because somewhere deep in your psyche, you're still that student terrified of getting the answer wrong. But here's what your teachers never told you, what they perhaps never understood themselves. The greatest achievements in human history, the most transformative discoveries, the innovations that changed everything, they all began with someone getting it spectacularly wrong. Thomas Edison didn't fail 10,000 times. He learned 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb. The Wright brothers didn't crash their gliders dozens of times because they were incompetent, they crashed them because that's how you learn to fly. Every successful person you admire has a graveyard of failures behind them that would make your modest setbacks look like minor hiccups. The difference? They unlearned what school taught them about failure. See, in the real world, the world outside those classroom walls, failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the tuition you pay for success. It's the laboratory where understanding is forged. It's the crucible that transforms theory into mastery. When you launched that side hustle that never took off, you didn't fail. You got an MBA in market reality that cost you a few $100s instead of 100,000. When that relationship ended, you didn't waste years, you learned exactly what you need and what you won't tolerate. When that investment went south, you didn't lose money, you bought wisdom that will serve you for decades. But school never taught you to reframe failure this way. School taught you that mistakes diminish your value, that errors go on your permanent record, and that getting something wrong makes you less than those who got it right. So now, you tiptoe through life, desperately trying to avoid any situation where you might fail, any venture where success isn't guaranteed, any path that doesn't come with a clear roadmap and a promise of validation. You've become a prisoner of your own need for certainty. And that certainty? It's costing you everything you actually want. The merchant who built his fortune refused to pivot when the market shifted. The relationship withered because neither person could admit they'd grown. The dream you buried because the path forward wasn't clear. This is the toll. And here's what makes it particularly insidious. Your mind has convinced you this rigidity is protection. It whispers that if you just hold firm to what you know, you'll be safe. Admitting uncertainty is admitting weakness. That changing your position means you were wrong before. But let me ask you something. Which requires more strength? Clinging to a belief because you've always held it, or examining it honestly and having the courage to evolve? I changed my mind about slavery, about governance, about religion, about human nature itself. Each time, it would have been easier to maintain my position, to protect my ego, to avoid the discomfort of growth. But I learned something crucial. The people who become truly formidable in this world aren't the ones who never change. They're the ones who change thoughtfully and deliberately. There's a particular kind of person I came to recognize during my years navigating politics. You'd see them in every assembly, every negotiation. They were intelligent, often more educated than their peers, yet they were perpetually frustrated, perpetually stuck. Their problem wasn't a lack of knowledge. It was that they'd confused consistency with integrity. They believed that admitting error or uncertainty would undermine their credibility, when in fact it was their refusal to adapt that made them irrelevant. Meanwhile, the ones who shaped history, we were constantly recalibrating, not flip-flopping mindlessly, but updating our understanding as new information emerges. We were secure enough in ourselves that changing our minds didn't threaten our identity. You need to understand something fundamental. Your beliefs are not you. Your opinions are not your essence. They're tools for navigating reality, and when a tool stops working, you get a better one. I learned this lesson in the most practical way imaginable. In my early years, I was convinced that vegetarianism was the enlightened path. I'd read Thomas Tryon's work, and I became certain that eating animal flesh was barbaric and unnecessary. I preached this doctrine to anyone who would listen. I felt morally superior to those who consumed meat. Then one day, I was on a ship, and we caught some cod. As they were cleaning the fish, I watched smaller fish spill out from their bellies, and something clicked in my mind. These fish had been eating other fish. If nature itself operated on this principle, who was I to declare it universally wrong? Notice what I did there. I didn't cling to my position, because admitting I was wrong would damage my ego. I didn't twist logic into pretzels trying to explain away what I'd observed. I simply acknowledged that my previous conviction, however sincerely held, had been based on incomplete reasoning. I went back to eating meat, not because I was weak or because I gave up my principles, but because my principles had evolved with new information. Here's what made that possible. I had never confused my dietary philosophy with my identity. I was Benjamin Franklin, who currently practiced vegetarianism, not Benjamin Franklin, the eternal vegetarian. Do you see the difference? One is a preference, the other is a prison. The people who suffer most in life are those who've built their entire sense of self around being right about particular things. They've turned their opinions into load-bearing walls of their personality. Remove one belief, and they fear the entire structure will collapse. But that's only true if you've built poorly. The wise person builds their identity on their commitment to truth-seeking, not on any particular truth they currently hold. They define themselves by their method, not their conclusions. Their foundation is curiosity, humility, and reason, not any specific belief that might prove false tomorrow. This is why I spent so much time in my junto, that small club of tradesmen and thinkers I formed in Philadelphia, creating a culture where being wrong was not shameful but educational. We had a rule. No one could assert their opinion as certain. You had to preface your thoughts with phrases like "I conceive," or "it appears to me," or "if I'm not mistaken." This wasn't a weakness. It was intellectual strength. It was the acknowledgement that we were all still learning, all still revising, all still building better versions of understanding together. And you know what happened? The quality of our discussions improved dramatically. When you remove the social penalty for changing your mind, people actually start thinking instead of defending. They start listening instead of reloading their next argument. They start collaborating on truth instead of competing for dominance. Now, I'm not suggesting you become some wishy-washy person without convictions. That's not what intellectual humility means. You can hold strong beliefs, I certainly did, but you hold them as your current best understanding, not as an infallible gospel. You act on them with confidence while remaining open to correction. You commit to decisions without becoming imprisoned by them. Think of it like navigation. When I crossed the Atlantic multiple times, studying ocean currents and temperature, I had charts and hypotheses. I acted on them decisively. I had to, or I'd never reach shore. But I also kept measuring, kept observing, kept adjusting, when the evidence suggested my charts were incomplete. Strong convictions, loosely held, decisive action, humbly corrected. The tragedy I see today is people treating their beliefs like precious heirlooms that must be preserved at all costs, rather than like tools that should be upgraded when better ones become available. Your grandfather's hammer might have sentimental value, but if there's a better hammer available, and you're building something important, which one should you use? The attachment to being right, rather than getting it right. This is perhaps the greatest barrier to wisdom. I've watched brilliant minds waste decades defending positions they adopted in their youth, not because the evidence supported those positions, but because their identity had become intertwined with them. They confused changing their mind with losing themselves. Let me be clear about something. Your beliefs are not you. They're simply your best current understanding. When you get new information that contradicts them, updating isn't defeat. It's growth. It's the very mechanism by which humans improve. I kept what I called my book of errors, a literal notebook where I recorded my mistakes and what I learned from them. Some people thought this morbid. Why dwell on failures? But I saw it differently. Each error was expensive. It cost me time, money, reputation, or peace of mind. Having paid that price, I was determined to extract every lesson from it. Writing them down ensured I wouldn't pay for the same lesson twice. What would your book of errors look like? Most people I observe today don't even acknowledge their errors, let alone study them. They experience a failure, feel bad for a moment, then immediately move on and forget the specifics. A year later, they made virtually the same mistake because they treated it as a random misfortune rather than as data. This connects to something I advocated throughout my life. Systems over events. Don't just fix the immediate problem. Fix the system that allowed the problem to occur. When I noticed the streets of Philadelphia weren't being cleaned, I didn't just clean my own street once. I organized a system where everyone contributed to keeping all streets clean. When I saw firefighting was chaotic, I didn't just help put out one fire, I created the first fire department. Your personal growth works the same way. If you find yourself repeatedly facing the same type of problem, difficult relationships, financial troubles, missed opportunities, stop treating each instance as an isolated event. There's a system creating these outcomes, and that system is your habitual thoughts and behaviors. Change the system, and you change every output that follows. This is why I never believed in the mythology of sudden transformation. The drunk who swears off liquor in a moment of clarity, the debtor who promises to change after one more bailout, the quarrelsome man who vows to control his temper after yet another burnt bridge. These declarations are worthless, without understanding the invisible architecture beneath the behavior. True change begins when you realize you're not battling individual demons. You're restructuring the temple they inhabit. I spent decades observing patterns in others because I was obsessed with identifying them in myself. Every Saturday evening, I would review my week with uncomfortable honesty. Not what happened to me, but what I had created through my choices. This practice was excruciating at first. The mind resists seeing its own machinery. We prefer to believe we're responding to circumstances rather than generating them. But here's what that weekly audit revealed. My worst weeks always followed the same script. They began with small permissions I'd granted myself. Staying up too late, skipping my morning routine, indulging in gossip, postponing difficult conversations. These weren't random lapses. They were the system announcing itself, testing whether I was paying attention. The beautiful paradox is that once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. It's like learning that a particular sound in your house means the roof is leaking. Before you identified it, the sound was just noise. After, it's a diagnosis demanding action. Your life is speaking to you in patterns right now. The question is whether you're listening. Consider the pattern of perpetual busyness without accomplishment. Many people wear exhaustion as a badge of honor, convinced their fatigue proves their value. But when you examine their weeks closely, you find a pattern. They're busy with everything, except what matters. They respond to every request, attend every meeting, and engage with every distraction. This isn't bad luck or circumstance. It's a system perfectly designed to create the feeling of productivity while avoiding the risk of actual creation. Why? Because genuine creation requires confronting uncertainty. It demands you produce something that might fail, might be criticized, might reveal your limitations. Busyness is a sophisticated defense mechanism. It lets you collapse into bed each night feeling justified in your exhaustion while never facing the terrifying blank page of true work. The pattern protects you from what you fear most: being seen, being judged, being found insufficient. I watch people construct elaborate productivity systems apps that track their time in 15-minute increments, planners that break their days into color-coded blocks, methodologies with names that sound like military operations. They mistake the scaffolding for the cathedral. They confuse the map for the territory. The truth? Most productivity advice is designed to make you feel productive while keeping you perpetually distracted from the work that matters. It's a form of sanctioned procrastination, blessed by the gods of optimization. Real work doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It doesn't wait for the perfect productivity system or ideal conditions. It happens in the unglamorous spaces between your grand plans and the 20 minutes before dinner, in the early morning hour before anyone wakes, in the stolen moments you could easily fill with one more email check. The writer Anne Lamott talks about Bird by Bird, how her brother, paralyzed by a school project on birds, was told by their father to just take it bird by bird. That's the secret they don't mention in the hustle culture manifestos. Progress isn't made in heroic marathon sessions fueled by coffee and determination. It's made in small, consistent deposits that compound over months and years. But small and consistent doesn't sell courses. It doesn't make for inspiring Instagram posts. It's not the story we want to hear because it requires something more difficult than intensity. It requires patience. You see the tension now, don't you? We worship speed while the things that matter most require slowness. We celebrate quantity while quality demands singular focus. We prize efficiency while mastery is inherently inefficient, full of dead ends, false starts, and necessary failures. The apprentice blacksmith must ruin hundreds of pieces before forging something useful. The painter must fill canvases with failures before touching greatness. The writer must write terrible first drafts that will never see daylight. There is no hack, no shortcut, no growth hack that bypasses this necessary stage. Yet we keep searching for it. We keep believing that someone, somewhere, has discovered the secret passage that lets you skip the trudging through the valley. This is the final lie of hustle culture, that there's a way to have the destination without the journey, the trophy without the training, the mastery without the monotony. There isn't. And perhaps that's why we're so miserable. We've been sold a fantasy that doesn't exist, and when we inevitably can't achieve it, we blame ourselves. We think we're broken. We think we're not trying hard enough. We scroll through Instagram and see someone's highlight reel, the book launch, the six-figure month, the keynote speech, and we think, they figured it out, why can't I? But here's what you're not seeing. The 200 mornings they woke up at 5 a.m. and wrote badly. The 14 draft proposals that got rejected. The years of speaking for free at community centers before anyone paid them a dime. You're not seeing the valley. You're only seeing the summit photo, and you're wondering why you can't teleport there directly. I've seen this destroy people. Genuinely talented people who quit right before the breakthrough because they couldn't reconcile the gap between the fantasy they were promised and the reality they were living. They thought something was wrong. They thought the struggle meant they weren't meant for it. But the struggle was the whole point. The struggle was the forge. Every person you admire went through this. Every single one. The difference isn't that they avoided the valley, it's that they accepted it. They made peace with the fact that mastery is built in 10,000 invisible hours that no one will ever applaud. They understood that the work that matters most is the work no one sees. And this is where we reclaim our power. Because once you stop waiting for the shortcut, once you stop believing in the myth of the overnight success, something shifts. You stop measuring yourself against other people's highlight reels. You stop feeling inadequate because you're still in the weeds. You realize that being in the weeds is exactly where you're supposed to be. The valley isn't a detour. It's the path. And everyone who's arrived at anything worth arriving at walked through it. There's a strange freedom in that, isn't there? In knowing that you're not behind. You're not broken. You're exactly where the work happens. Because understand this, the gap between where you are and where you want to be isn't a canyon you fell into by accident. It's the workspace. It's the studio. It's the laboratory where transformation actually occurs. Most people spend their entire lives trying to skip this part. They want the highlight reel without the footage that ends up on the cutting room floor. They want the masterpiece without the failed sketches. They want the symphony without the hours of scales and wrong notes. But I learned something in my print shop. Something that applies whether you're setting type or setting goals. The mess is mandatory. When I was developing my printing techniques, my shop was in chaos. Ink everywhere. Failed pages stacked in corners. Experiments that went nowhere. And there were days, many days, when I looked at that disorder and thought, am I just fooling myself? Is this progress or just mess? The difference I came to understand wasn't always visible in the moment. Progress and mess can look identical in real time. The distinction only becomes clear in retrospect. When you look back and realize that every failed attempt taught you something essential, that every wrong turn helped you map the territory. You see, society has sold you a dangerous fiction, that successful people have their lives together, that they wake up with clarity, move through their days with purpose, and go to bed with satisfaction. Let me tell you what actually happens. Successful people wake up with doubt. They move through their days, making their best guesses. They go to bed, wondering if they're on the right track. The difference isn't that they have more certainty, it's that they've made peace with uncertainty. They've learned to work within the chaos rather than waiting for it to clear. I remember negotiating treaties in France, representing a young nation that barely existed. Do you think I felt qualified? Do you think I had all the answers? I was making it up as I went, just like everyone else in that room. The only difference was that I showed up anyway. Look, I'm not saying doubt disappears. That would be lying to you. And I didn't spend my whole life pursuing truth just to start feeding you comfortable fiction now. The doubt never goes away completely. It just changes its shape. In 1776, when I was in France, trying to convince the most powerful monarchy in Europe to fund our little rebellion, you know what kept me up at night? Not the fear of failure. I'd failed plenty of times before. It was the weight of everyone's hope resting on my shoulders. Every soldier freezing at Valley Forge. Every farmer who signed that declaration knew it might mean a noose around his neck. Every mother who sent her son to fight. They were all counting on me to come through. That's a different kind of pressure than wondering if you're good enough. That's the pressure of knowing other people believe you're good enough, even when you're not sure yourself. And here's what nobody tells you about that moment when you finally step into the arena. The imposter syndrome doesn't vanish. It evolves. You go from, I don't belong here, to, I'm here, but what if I let everyone down? You go from, what if they discover I'm a fraud, to, what if I can't live up to what they think I am? It's still fear. There's still doubt. But it's doubt from the inside of the room instead of the outside. And you want to know the secret? That's actually progress. Because the person standing outside the room, paralyzed by fear, isn't helping anyone. Not themselves. Not the people who need their contribution. Not the world that's waiting for what only they can offer. But the person inside the room, working despite their doubts, that person is doing something. They're trying. They're contributing. They're in the game. I learned something important during all those years in France. The French court was full of brilliant people. Philosophers, scientists, artists, nobles, educated in ways I never was. And yes, sometimes I felt like that printer's son from Boston again, out of his depth. But I was the one who secured the alliance. Not because I was the smartest person in the room, because I was the one willing to show up every single day and do the work. Let me tell you what most people get wrong about persistence. They think it's about being stubborn, about refusing to change course, about banging your head against the same wall over and over until either the wall breaks or you do. That's not persistence. That's just stupidity wearing a motivational quote. Real persistence is adaptive. It's showing up every day, yes, but showing up with your eyes open, learning, adjusting. Try a different angle when the first one doesn't work. When I first tried to establish a public library in Philadelphia, people laughed at me. Who's going to donate books? Who's going to pay for it? Why would anyone share their private collection with strangers? I could have given up. Or I could have kept pushing the same proposal that wasn't working. Instead, I changed my approach. I made it a subscription service, 50 shillings to join, then 10 shillings a year. Suddenly, it wasn't charity, it was a club. People want to belong to clubs. They want to be part of something exclusive, even if that exclusivity is just the ability to read books. The Library Company of Philadelphia opened in 1731. It's still there today. Not because my first idea was perfect, but because I kept showing up with better ideas until one worked. This is what persistence actually looks like. It's not romantic. It's not a montage set to inspiring music. It's mundane problem solving, day after day, failure after failure, until you finally hit on something that works. And here's the thing nobody tells you. Even when something works, it probably won't work forever. The world changes. People change. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. So you adapt again. You persist in your goals, but you stay flexible in your methods. I spent years perfecting the lightning rod, but I didn't just build one design and call it finished. I tested different materials, different heights, different installation methods. Every storm brought new data. Every building struck by lightning taught me something. I mapped Philadelphia like a general mapping a battlefield. Every church spire, every tall structure, I studied them. Where should the rod be placed? How should it be grounded? These weren't academic questions anymore. These were questions that determined whether families lived or died. The public resistance. It tested me in ways the experiments never had. Science, you see, follows logic. People follow fear, and fear is a far more powerful force than lightning itself. I remember one incident that crystallized everything. A wealthy merchant, let's call him Thomas, finally agreed to install a rod on his home. His neighbors were furious. They gathered at his door like an angry mob, demanding he remove it. Their argument? That he was playing God, that he was attracting divine judgment to their street. Thomas stood there, terrified, looking at me for help, and I realized something profound in that moment. The lightning rod wasn't just a scientific device. It was a mirror. It reflected to people their deepest beliefs about the universe, about God, about their place in creation. I could have lectured them about electricity. I could have shown them my data. Instead, I asked them a simple question. Do you use umbrellas when it rains? They looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Of course, they used umbrellas. And does God strike you down for trying to stay dry? I continued. Does protecting yourself from rain mean you're defying His will? The silence that followed was profound. Because suddenly, they saw the absurdity of their position. If protecting yourself from rain was acceptable, why wasn't protecting yourself from lightning? One by one, they dispersed. Thomas kept his lightning rod, and within a year, his neighbors were asking me to install their own. That's when I understood the real work. Changing minds is slower than changing metal into electricity, but it's just as essential. The conductor was working. The science was proven. But what good is a shield if pride keeps a man from raising it? I watched this paradox unfold 100 times. A merchant would lose his warehouse to lightning, his life's inventory turned to ash and memory. His neighbor, separated by merely a stone wall, would remain untouched, protected by a simple iron rod I'd installed months before. You'd think the burned merchant would immediately seek me out, would beg for that same protection. More often than not, he'd rebuild without it. I've had bad luck, he'd tell himself. Lightning won't strike the same area twice. As if the sky kept a ledger of its targets. As if atmospheric electricity respected human superstition. I learned to recognize the look in a man's eyes when his worldview was crumbling. But his ego was building walls faster than reason could tear them down. It's a particular kind of blindness. They could see the charred remains of their property, could smell the lingering smoke, could calculate their losses down to the shilling. But they couldn't see the obvious solution standing 20 feet away on their neighbor's roof. Sometimes I'd be direct. Your neighbor's building stands because of a rod like this one. The lightning didn't avoid his property. It was simply guided safely to the ground. My neighbor was fortunate, they'd respond. Different circumstances entirely. Different circumstances. As if geography worked differently for buildings 10 feet apart. As if physics played favorites based on who believed in it more earnestly. The fascinating part was watching how they'd convince themselves. They'd attribute their neighbor's safety to building materials, to the direction the structure faced, to the quality of the foundation. Anything but the visible, tangible, provable rod conducting electricity harmlessly into the earth. I began to understand something that changed how I approached everything afterward. People don't resist new ideas because the ideas are complex. They resist because accepting the new idea means admitting they were wrong about the old one. And for many, being wrong feels more dangerous than being burned. So I stopped trying to prove them wrong. I started asking questions instead. Tell me about your neighbor's building, I'd say. What do you think makes it different from yours? Let them talk. Let them work through their own reasoning. Eventually, most would stumble onto the truth themselves and claim it as their own insight. My pride didn't require credit for the revelation. The buildings didn't care who convinced whom, they just needed the protection. This approach took longer, much longer. But the conductors installed after these conversations never came down. The ones installed after arguments often did. The difference taught me something profound about human nature. We think we resist change because we fear being wrong. But truly, we fear something far deeper. We fear being dismissed. Being told rather than consulted. Having our lived experience ignored by someone who arrived yesterday with theories written in a city they'll never visit. The lightning rod worked not just because the science was sound, but because I made others feel part of its soundness. That's the paradox those letters don't capture. Influence isn't about having the right answer. It's about creating the conditions where others can arrive at that answer and claim ownership of it. I think of the young Franklin, arriving in Philadelphia with nothing but printer's ink under his fingernails and opinions about everything. How insufferable I must have been. How certain. How quick to correct every error I witnessed, convinced that truth alone was persuasive. It took years to understand that I was sabotaging myself with every correction. Not because I was wrong, I was usually right, but because being right without being relational is just being alone. And lonely people don't change the world. Connected people do. This is perhaps the greatest deception of modern achievement culture. We're taught that competence opens doors. Master your craft, we're told, and influence follows naturally. It's a beautiful lie that protects us from the harder truth. Competence without connection is merely performance. It impresses but doesn't influence. It wins arguments but loses allies. The junto succeeded not because we were the smartest men in Philadelphia, though we weren't without our talents, but because we structured our meetings around a radical premise. Your idea might be wrong, my idea might be wrong, and we're going to explore both possibilities with genuine curiosity. Every proposal had to be presented as a question. Not, we should build a library, but what would be the likely effects of establishing a subscription library in our city? The grammatical shift seems trivial. The psychological impact was revolutionary. When people heard a question instead of a declaration, something remarkable happened. Their defenses lowered. Their curiosity awakened. Instead of preparing counter-arguments, they began genuinely considering possibilities. I watched hardened merchants-men who would have dismissed any direct suggestion as presumptuous lean forward with interest when asked, might there be merit in pooling our resources for books that would benefit all? The very same proposal that would have been rejected as a statement became fascinating as a question. The junto debated everything through this method: street lighting, fire protection, education reform, and currency systems. Every topic entered as an inquiry, not an edict. And here's what I discovered. When you ask, instead of assert, you don't just avoid resistance, you create collaboration. People who help answer a question feel ownership of the solution. They become invested. The library wasn't my project that others funded, it became our collective achievement that we all shaped together. That sense of shared creation is worth more than 1,000 compelling arguments. This principle extended far beyond the junto's Friday meetings. I used it in the Pennsylvania Assembly, where factions fought over every issue. I used it in London, negotiating colonial interests with ministers who considered themselves my superiors. I used it in France, where direct American demands would have been laughed out of Versailles. The question, how might we structure a postal system that serves all colonies efficiently, opened doors that the statement, we need a better postal system, would have slammed shut. But here's the deeper truth I learned. This wasn't manipulation. It was honest intellectual humility. Because when I posed genuine questions, I was acknowledging a fundamental reality: I didn't have all the answers. None of us does. The wisest path forward usually requires multiple perspectives, experiences, and insights. The merchant understood commerce in ways I didn't. The printer knew production constraints I'd overlooked. The physician brought medical considerations I'd never imagined. By asking rather than telling, I wasn't just being strategic, I was being smart. This is why dictators throughout history have feared questions more than criticisms. A criticism can be refuted. A question opens infinite possibilities. I learned this lesson most powerfully during the Constitutional Convention. We had men in that room who believed they possessed absolute truth, that their vision for America was the only correct vision. They would make proclamations as if carved in stone by divine hand. But the document we created? It emerged not from those who proclaimed certainty, but from those who asked better questions. What if we separated powers? What if we allowed for amendment? What if we built in mechanisms to correct our own inevitable mistakes? The Constitution's genius isn't that we got everything right. We didn't. We made terrible compromises that would haunt the nation for centuries. Rather, its genius is that we built a framework that assumed we would be wrong, that anticipated the need for correction, that embedded humility into the very structure of government. This is the pattern of all genuine progress. When I experimented with electricity, I didn't begin by proclaiming what lightning was. I began by admitting I didn't know, and asking, what if we could test it? What if we could capture it? What if it follows laws we can understand? Every discovery began with intellectual humility, with the willingness to say, "I don't know," and mean it as an invitation rather than a defeat. Now contrast this with the modern landscape of influence. Social media has created a devastating incentive structure. Confidence gets rewarded with engagement. Certainty spreads faster than curiosity. The algorithm favors the person who proclaims, "This is exactly why everything is broken," over the person who asks, "What if we're missing something important here?" The result? We've created echo chambers where influence is measured not by the quality of one's questions but by the volume of one's certainty. Where admitting uncertainty is seen as weakness, rather than the foundation of wisdom. I've watched this pattern destroy marriages, companies, and communities. Two people who once loved each other become strangers because neither can admit they might be wrong. An organization collapses because leadership confuses confidence with competence. A community fractures because everyone is so certain of their rightness that listening becomes impossible. The antidote isn't to abandon conviction. I had strong convictions about liberty, about reason, about human potential, but I held them lightly enough to let reality reshape them. I was wrong about many things. Ask my son William about my political predictions. The key is developing what I call strong opinions, loosely held. Form your hypotheses firmly enough to act on them, but hold them gently enough to abandon when evidence demands it. The fool and the fanatic are certain of everything. The wise person questions even their certainties. I tested this principle daily in my printing shop. Each week, I held strong opinions about what Pennsylvanians wanted to read, but I measured those opinions against actual sales. When my assumptions proved wrong, I changed my inventory, not my mind. This pragmatic flexibility, applied to ideas rather than goods, became my intellectual trademark. The most dangerous opinions are those we inherit without examination. I was raised to certain religious views, certain political assumptions, and certain social hierarchies. For years I simply accepted them as one accepts the weather. But eventually I asked, what if I'm wrong? What if these inherited certainties are simply comfortable prejudices? That question changed everything. I began examining every belief as I would examine a suspicious coin, testing its weight, checking its authenticity, verifying its value. Some beliefs passed the test and grew stronger. Others crumbled under scrutiny, revealed as counterfeit wisdom passed down through generations of unquestioning acceptance. This process isn't comfortable. We develop emotional attachments to our opinions, especially those we've held longest or defended most vigorously. Admitting error feels like admitting foolishness. But here's the liberating truth. Changing your mind isn't weakness, it's growth. The tree that never bends breaks in the storm. The mind that never changes calcifies into irrelevance. I changed my mind about countless matters throughout my life. About religion moving from rigid dogma to ethical deism. About governance evolving from a loyal British subject to a revolutionary architect. About human nature itself, learning that people are neither inherently good nor evil, but marvelously capable of both. Each reversal brought clarity, not confusion. Each admission of error opened a new understanding. The opinions I held at 20 would have made me a fossil at 80. Instead, I remained engaged, evolving, and learning until my final days. The modern obsession with being right would have baffled me. I see it in your political discourse, your social exchanges, and your workplace dynamics. People defend positions they adopted 5 minutes ago as though their very souls depend on never admitting doubt. What exhausting prisons you build for yourselves. I changed my mind about slavery, a shame it took me so long, but change I did. I altered my views on British governance, on religious doctrine, and on scientific theories I myself had proposed. Each reversal freed me rather than diminished me. You fear that changing your mind reveals weakness. I discovered it reveals strength. The strength to prioritize truth over ego, growth over consistency, wisdom over stubbornness. The most dangerous people I encountered were those whose opinions at 60 were identical to those at 16. They had stopped thinking decades earlier, merely defending ancient conclusions against all evidence. They became monuments to their younger selves, carved in stone while the world flowed past them like water. I made it a practice to befriend those who disagreed with me. My closest companions held views that contradicted my own. We argued vigorously, and I learned voraciously. Your algorithm-driven echo chambers would have horrified me, millions of people experiencing only reflections of their existing beliefs, never challenged, never stretched, never growing. Intellectual humility requires courage. It means approaching every conversation with the possibility that you might leave it changed. It means reading books by authors who oppose your worldview. It means asking, what if I'm wrong about this? Not as self-doubt, but as intellectual hygiene. I published anonymous essays arguing against positions I publicly held, just to ensure I understood the opposing view. I forced myself to make the strongest possible case against my own conclusions. If I couldn't articulate why someone might disagree with me, I didn't understand the issue well enough. This practice transformed my thinking. Issues I thought were simple revealed hidden complexity. People I dismissed as foolish turned out to hold wisdom I had overlooked. The world expanded every time I admitted uncertainty. Your society seems to reward certainty above all else. Your leaders speak in absolute terms, your experts tolerate no questions, and your citizens defend tribal positions with religious fervor. Meanwhile, the humble admit they might be wrong and are labeled as weak, indecisive, and lacking conviction. But conviction without humility is just stubbornness with better marketing. I've watched movements rise and fall on this pattern. A reform begins with honest questions. How might we improve this? And attracts thoughtful minds. But success breeds certainty. The questions calcify into answers, the answers into doctrine, the doctrine into identity. Soon, the movement that began by questioning everything cannot question itself. It has become the very thing it opposed, just wearing different colors. The environmental movement showed this trajectory perfectly. It began with scientists asking, what if we're damaging our only home? A humble, terrifying question that demanded investigation. But watch what happened. Nuance disappeared. Nuclear power, potentially our cleanest energy, became heresy because it didn't fit the narrative. Anyone suggesting we might adapt to some changes rather than prevent all changes was excommunicated. The movement that began with scientific humility became doctrinally rigid, and in that rigidity, lost potential allies who might have helped but couldn't accept the entire catechism, or consider capitalism's true believers. I was a businessman myself, printed money, balanced colonial budgets, understood markets. But today's devotees speak of free markets with the fervor of crusaders. They cannot acknowledge what even Adam Smith knew. Markets are tools, not gods. They work brilliantly for some problems, and fail spectacularly at others. A humble capitalist says, here's where markets excel, and here's where we need other mechanisms. An arrogant one insists every problem, education, healthcare, love itself, should be solved by market forces. It's intellectual monotheism. Both sides think they're different. Both are identically rigid. You see it in how you treat complexity. Real problems rarely have clean solutions. Climate change, poverty, education, justice, these are tangles of competing goods and unavoidable trade-offs. The humble mind says, this is complicated. We'll need multiple approaches and should expect unintended consequences. The arrogant mind says, the solution is obvious. Anyone who doesn't see it is stupid or evil. That last part is the tell. When you assume disagreement stems from stupidity or malice rather than different experiences, values, or information, that's arrogance masquerading as insight. I've watched friendships fracture over political disagreements that started exactly this way. Two intelligent people who once respected each other are suddenly unable to see anything but moral failure in the other's position, not because either became a monster, but because both lost the humility to recognize that reasonable people can weigh the same evidence differently. I knew a physician once, a brilliant woman, genuinely compassionate, who supported certain health policies I found troubling. My first instinct was to dismiss her as captured by industry interests or blind to obvious harms. But when I actually listened to her reasoning, I found someone grappling thoughtfully with genuine dilemmas: how to balance individual liberty with public health, how to allocate scarce resources, how to act amid scientific uncertainty. We still disagreed, but I could no longer pretend her position was born from stupidity or evil. It was born from a different weighting of legitimate concerns. That's what humility gives you: the ability to disagree without demonizing. To say, I think you're wrong, but I understand why someone reasonable might see it your way. Arrogance can't do that. Arrogance needs villains. Here's another marker. Asterisk, asterisk. How you respond when someone changes their mind. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The humble person celebrates it. I'm glad you updated your view based on new information that takes courage. The arrogant person mocks it. Oh, so now you finally see what I've been saying all along? About time. One response encourages intellectual honesty and growth. The other punishes it, ensuring people will dig into wrong positions rather than risk the humiliation of admitting evolution. I've changed my mind on significant things over the years. Views I held confidently at 30 looked embarrassingly simplistic at 50. Not because I was stupid then, but because I had less information, less experience, less wisdom. The same will be true when I'm 70, looking back at 50. This pattern holds across everything. My understanding of virtue evolved dramatically. Young Franklin thought virtue was about strict self-discipline and perfection. I created elaborate charts to track my moral progress, believing I could achieve perfection through willpower alone. Older Franklin realized virtue is about wisdom in application, not rigid adherence to rules. Sometimes kindness means breaking a promise. Sometimes honesty means withholding the truth. Sometimes justice means mercy. The principles remained constant, but their application became infinitely more nuanced. My political philosophy underwent a similar evolution. I once believed rational debate could solve any disagreement. Present people with facts and logic, and they would inevitably reach correct conclusions. How charmingly naive. Decades in politics taught me that human motivation is far more complex. People aren't primarily moved by logic. They're moved by interest, emotion, identity, and tribal belonging. Effective persuasion requires understanding these forces, not pretending they don't exist. This didn't make me cynical. It made me effective. Instead of lecturing people about what logic demanded, I learned to align proposals with their existing interests. Instead of attacking their positions directly, I asked questions that led them to reconsider. Instead of claiming certainty, I offered opinions tentatively, making space for others to adopt them as their own. The wisdom wasn't in abandoning principle. It was in understanding that principle divorced from human nature accomplishes nothing. The greatest ideals mean nothing if you can't persuade actual humans to embrace them. My understanding of success transformed entirely. Young Franklin equated success with achievement, recognition, and accumulation. Each accomplishment was a trophy to be displayed. Each honor, a validation of worth. Older Franklin realized success is measured in impact and relationships. The experiments that brought me fame matter far less than the institutions that continue helping people after I'm gone. The honors I received are footnotes. The library, the hospital, the fire company, the philosophical society, these are the true measures of a life well lived. This shift changed everything about how I approached my remaining years. Instead of seeking new honors, I focused on strengthening institutions. Instead of chasing recognition, I invested in relationships. Instead of accumulating more, I considered what legacy I would leave behind. The mind, you see, seeks patterns even in emptiness. It creates structures to fill the void where meaning once resided. I observed this in myself during a particularly cold winter in Philadelphia. I had completed yet another negotiation, secured another diplomatic victory, and received another round of congratulations. Yet returning to my study, I felt nothing but the weight of the coat on my shoulders. I began a curious experiment then, one I documented but never shared publicly. Each evening, I would list 3 things I had accomplished that day. Then beside each accomplishment, I would write what it truly meant to me, not what it meant to others, not what history might say, but what it meant to the man writing by candlelight. The results unsettled me. Most days, I could find no authentic meaning. The space beside my accomplishments remained blank. I was performing for an audience that existed only in my imagination, chasing approval from ghosts of my own creation. This realization led to what I now consider my second education. My first education taught me how to succeed in the world. My second teacher taught me how to succeed at being human. I began to notice how fear disguised itself as ambition, how my constant need to be useful was really a terror of being forgotten, how my famous wits served as armor against genuine vulnerability, how my endless projects were elaborate distractions from the simple question, who was Benjamin Franklin when no one was watching? The answer terrified me because for years, there was no answer. I had become my reputation, my achievements, my public persona. Strip those away, and I feared there would be nothing left but air. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the human soul. Slowly, quietly, I began to discover who existed beneath the accomplishments. This man was less impressive than his public counterpart, more doubtful, more afraid, more ordinary. But he was real. And in his reality, I found something success had never provided: peace. I started small. I allowed myself entire afternoons with no agenda. I sat with friends without trying to impress them. I wrote letters that would never be published. I made mistakes without rushing to justify them. I felt sadness without immediately seeking distraction. These simple acts felt revolutionary because they were. The mind resists stillness because stillness reveals what motion conceals. In movement, we can tell ourselves we are productive, that we are solving problems, that we are managing our lives. But when we stop, we discover the truth. Many of our solutions were simply more sophisticated forms of avoidance. I began noticing a pattern in my relationships. When someone expressed hurt or disappointment, my immediate response was to fix, explain, or redirect. If a friend said they felt neglected, I would immediately list my recent efforts to stay connected. If my partner expressed sadness, I would offer solutions before acknowledging the emotion itself. This wasn't compassion. It was comfort-seeking disguised as care. I was trying to resolve my own discomfort with their pain, rather than truly being present for them. Learning to simply listen without fixing, without explaining, without offering immediate solutions became one of the most challenging practices I undertook. It required trusting that presence itself has value, that witnessing someone's pain without rushing to eliminate it is an act of profound respect. I practiced saying, "That sounds really difficult," instead of, "Have you tried?" I learned to sit with uncomfortable silence instead of filling it with reassurance. I discovered that people rarely need me to solve their problems. They need me to acknowledge that their problems are real. This shift transformed my relationships in ways I hadn't anticipated. People began sharing more openly because they felt heard rather than managed. Conflicts that once escalated into debates about who was right became conversations about what each person needed. The space between us, once filled with anxious fixing, became a container for genuine connection. The practice extended beyond relationships. I began applying the same principle to my own ambitions and failures. When a project didn't succeed, instead of immediately pivoting to the next thing or creating elaborate explanations, I would pause and ask, "What is this failure teaching me? What am I being invited to notice?" Often, the answer surprised me. A failed creative project might reveal that I had been chasing external validation rather than genuine interest. A missed opportunity might show that I had been forcing a path that wasn't truly aligned with my values. The failure itself wasn't the problem. My frantic attempts to avoid learning from it were. The moments of genuine transformation came not in the successes that followed failure, but in the quiet spaces where I stopped fighting reality and started listening to it. These weren't dramatic revelations, no lightning bolts of understanding, no sudden clarity that made everything make sense. They were subtle shifts, like the way your eyes gradually adjust to darkness until you can see shapes you didn't know were there. I remember sitting with a particularly painful professional setback, one that had shattered my carefully constructed image of where my career should be heading. For weeks, I had cycled through the usual responses: denial, anger, frantic planning to fix everything. Then one evening, exhausted from fighting, I simply stopped. I didn't try to find the lesson. I didn't search for the silver lining. I just sat with the uncomfortable truth that this path I had been forcing wasn't working, and that maybe, just maybe, there was something important in that discord. What emerged wasn't a solution, but a question I had been too afraid to ask. What if I had been building toward a version of success that was never truly mine? The career trajectory I was mourning wasn't one I had chosen from genuine desire, but one I had absorbed from expectations, comparisons, and a deep fear of being seen as less than. The failure hadn't derailed my true path. It had revealed that I wasn't on it to begin with. This is what failure offers when we stop treating it as an enemy to be conquered or a puzzle to be solved. It shows us where we've been lying to ourselves. Not with malicious intent, but with the kind of self-deception that comes from trying to be the person we think we should be, rather than discovering who we actually are. And here's what makes this revelation both liberating and terrifying. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize that you've been performing a version of yourself rather than inhabiting yourself, every subsequent choice becomes a referendum on whether you'll continue the performance or step into something more authentic. I watched this unfold with a colleague who'd built an impressive career in corporate law. From the outside, everything looked pristine. The corner office, the prestigious clients, the kind of trajectory that makes parents proud at dinner parties. But in private conversations, usually late at night when defenses were down, he'd confess that he felt like an actor who'd been playing the same role for so long he'd forgotten there was a difference between the character and himself. The failure that changed everything for him wasn't dramatic. He didn't lose a major case or get passed over for partnership. Instead, he failed at something small. He tried to explain to his young daughter what he did all day, and he couldn't make it sound interesting, even to himself. That moment of failing to summon enthusiasm for his own life's work cracked something open. What followed wasn't a Hollywood transformation where he immediately quit and opened a pottery studio. Instead, it was months of uncomfortable sitting with the question, if I'm not this person I've been being, then who am I? He discovered that the question itself was terrifying because he'd spent so much energy avoiding it. We build elaborate structures to protect ourselves from having to answer fundamental questions about identity and purpose. And failure, when it's honest enough, demolishes those structures without asking permission. The pattern I've observed repeatedly is this: people don't fear failure because they might not succeed at something. They fear it because it might force them to admit they've been succeeding at the wrong things. That's why someone can be objectively accomplished, yet feel hollow. The resume looks impressive, but it's someone else's resume, pursued according to someone else's values. The corporate executive who's climbed to the C-suite realizes they've been ascending a ladder they never chose to lean against in the first place. They did what they were supposed to do, went to the right schools, took the right jobs, made the right connections, but somewhere along the way, they stopped asking if any of it actually mattered to them. This is the cost of reflexive ambition, ambition without introspection. It propels you forward with tremendous force but no compass. You move fast, accomplish much, and arrive nowhere meaningful. I've watched this play out across centuries. The plantation owner who accumulated vast holdings but never asked what it cost him in soul. The industrialist who built an empire but lost his children in the process. The modern entrepreneur who sold a company for millions but can't remember the last time they felt genuinely excited about anything. Success without self-knowledge is just sophisticated sleepwalking. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. Our culture actively discourages the pause required for genuine reflection. We glorify the grind, the hustle, the relentless forward motion. Taking time to think deeply about what you actually want is framed as indulgent, impractical, or worse, lazy. But I'll tell you what's actually impractical. Spending decades pursuing goals that don't align with your values, then wondering why achievement feels so empty. That's not efficiency. That's tragedy wearing a business suit. The alternative requires something our productivity-obsessed world struggles with: stillness. Not the forced mindfulness of a corporate wellness program, but genuine, uncomfortable reflection. Ask yourself, if I could start over with my current knowledge, what would I do differently? Not superficial changes, which job, which city, but fundamental reorientations. Would I prioritize the same things? Value the same outcomes? Define success the same way? Most people avoid this question because they already know the answer would require changes they're not ready to make. It's easier to stay on the treadmill than to admit you're running in the wrong direction. The most dangerous phrase in personal development isn't, "I can't." It's, "I already know that." The person who says they can't at least recognizes a gap. The person who already knows everything has stopped learning, which means they've stopped growing, which means they're already dying. I watched someone dismiss an entire book because the first chapter covered concepts they'd heard before. What they didn't realize is that repetition at different life stages creates different understandings. The lesson you needed at 25 means something entirely different at 40. The wisdom you intellectually grasped years ago only becomes real when experience finally catches up to knowledge. There's knowing, and then there's knowing. You can know that exercise improves mental health without ever experiencing the clarity that comes after a hard workout. You can know that gratitude shifts perspective without ever feeling the actual emotional transformation. The gap between intellectual knowledge and embodied wisdom is where most people get stuck. I've made this mistake myself. I'd read about presence, mindfulness, and being in the moment. I'd nod along, thinking I understood. Then, one afternoon, I was eating lunch while scrolling through emails, planning my next task, and suddenly realized I had no idea what I'd just eaten. I'd consumed an entire meal on autopilot. That's when intellectual knowledge became visceral understanding. There's a massive difference. The frameworks work, but only if you actually implement them. Reading about compound interest doesn't build wealth. Understanding habit formation doesn't change behavior. Knowing you should call your parents more often doesn't strengthen relationships. The gap between knowing and doing is where dreams go to die. I used to think I was sophisticated because I could analyze why people failed. I'd watch someone make predictable mistakes and think, I'd never do that. Then I'd turn around and make different mistakes with identical underlying patterns. Understanding failure intellectually while failing differently in practice is not wisdom, it's delusion, with a better vocabulary. The real test isn't what you know. It's what you do when no one's watching, when you're tired, when it's inconvenient, when the initial motivation has faded, and all that's left is the decision to show up or not. I've watched people collect self-improvement content like trophies. They can quote Epictetus, recite principles from a dozen different philosophies, and explain the neuroscience of habit formation with impressive precision. But their lives? Unchanged. Their relationships? Still broken. Their potential? Still untapped. The gap between knowing and doing isn't just a gap, it's a chasm that swallows most people's potential entirely. And here's what's truly sobering. The more you know without applying, the harder application becomes. You build sophisticated justifications. You develop elaborate theories about why your situation is different, why the principles don't quite apply to your unique circumstances. You become an expert in everything except the one thing that matters: actual change. I see it constantly. Someone reads about morning routines, understands the value, and explains it eloquently to others, then sleeps until noon. Someone who grasps the importance of difficult conversations can articulate why avoidance damages relationships, then stays silent for another year. Someone comprehends that consistent small actions compound into massive results, then waits for motivation to strike like lightning. Knowledge without application doesn't just fail to help you. It actively harms you. It creates the illusion of progress while you remain stationary. It gives you the vocabulary to sound wise while acting foolish. It lets you feel superior to those who know less while achieving no more than they do. The most dangerous person isn't the one who knows nothing. It's the one who knows everything and does nothing. Because ignorance can be educated. But educated in action? That requires something far more difficult: honest self-confrontation. So ask yourself, what do I know that I'm not doing? What do I need to learn? What do I already understand that remains unimplemented in my actual life? That question will tell you everything about whether you're genuinely committed to growth or just addicted to the feeling of learning without the cost of changing. Because I've watched too many people collect wisdom like they're filling a library they never read. They attend seminars and take notes. They highlight passages and screenshot quotes. They nod enthusiastically when someone shares a profound insight. And then they go home and do exactly what they've always done. The gap between knowing and doing isn't a knowledge problem. It's a courage problem. It's a priority problem. It's an identity problem. I knew a man who read 17 books on marriage. 17. He could quote therapists and cite studies. He understood attachment theory and communication styles. He knew about active listening and emotional validation. And his marriage still fell apart. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because knowing felt like doing, and studying felt like progress, and understanding felt like enough. It wasn't. Knowledge without implementation is just entertainment with intellectual pretensions. It's a way to feel productive while remaining exactly where you are. And here's what makes it particularly insidious. The more you learn without doing, the more you reinforce a dangerous pattern. You teach yourself that thinking about change is the same as changing. That understanding a principle is equivalent to living it. That knowing better is close enough to doing better. It's not. Every time you learn something and don't apply it, you're training yourself in a form of sophisticated procrastination. You're building a habit of substituting consumption for creation, information for transformation. The people who actually grow, they do the opposite. They learn one thing and immediately ask, where can I apply this today? Not someday. Not when conditions are perfect. Today, they read about forgiveness and reach out to someone they've resented. They learn about discipline and change their morning routine tomorrow. They understand a principle and find one concrete way to live it this week. Not perfectly, not completely, but actually, because implementation Even imperfect implementation teaches you things no book ever could. It reveals complications theory never mentioned. It shows you your actual resistance, not your theoretical commitment. It turns abstract concepts into lived wisdom. I've learned that real transformation happens in the space between knowing and doing. Reading about patience won't make you patient. Studying theories of resilience won't make you resilient. Understanding the concept of delayed gratification intellectually while scrolling through instant content creates no actual change. The gap closes only through embodied practice. This is why I tell young people, choose one difficult thing and do it badly for a while. Let yourself be a beginner at something that matters. Not something easy, not something you're naturally gifted at, but something that requires you to struggle publicly with your own limitations. Learn to play an instrument where people can hear your missed notes. Take up a physical discipline where your awkwardness is visible. Start a creative project where your early attempts will be laughably inadequate compared to your taste. The humiliation is the curriculum. Because here's what happens in that crucible of awkward effort. You discover capacities that only emerge under pressure. You find patience you didn't know you possessed. You develop a tolerance for discomfort that no amount of reading could install. You build the actual neural pathways of persistence, not just the intellectual appreciation of it. I remember watching my grandson learn carpentry. For weeks, everything he built was crooked, unstable, aesthetically offensive. He knew what good work looked like, he could see it, appreciate it, critique it, but his hands couldn't yet execute what his mind understood. That gap was agonizing for him. But staying in that gap, working despite it, showing up day after day to produce imperfect work, that's where his real education happened. Not in the eventual mastery, but in the months of tolerating the distance between his vision and his current capacity. This is the education our systems rarely provide, the cultivation of comfortable discomfort, the ability to remain engaged with something difficult without needing immediate resolution or validation. We've built a world that eliminates this kind of friction wherever possible. Every inconvenience is treated as a problem to be solved. Every difficulty is a barrier to be removed. We've optimized for ease so aggressively that we've accidentally eliminated the very conditions that build capable, resilient humans. The result? Generations who are theoretically educated but practically fragile. People with impressive credentials who collapse under modest pressure. Individuals who can discuss complex ideas but can't tolerate basic discomfort.